Okay, well, welcome back from the break if you had one. We're here for our next session of electronics technologies manufacturing. In this session, we're going to have a roundtable discussion from three of our eminent guests. And we're also going to, I think, continue to read in threads from the morning session as that is relevant. We're making a bit of a transition from some of the quite specific questions of chip manufacturing, which have been occupying us in the first part, to broader discussion of hardware, and in our final session on labour. So we see you, Jenny. Thank you for joining us. We're looking forward to hearing from you too. So first we're going to open with Professor Jack Qiu, who is here as our host, has multiple hats in this series. Thank you once again for contributing your expertise. And then we're going to have two discussants. Professor Julian Thomas here from the Centre for Automated Decision Making in Society, ARC funded centre in Australia, has come all the way from Melbourne, so we're very grateful for you and your time zone change. And Professor Brett Neilson, who is here from Western Sydney University, where he has also, like Professor Roster, spent many years writing on labour, logistics, networks, ports, and many other institutions of work and economy in the Asian region. So thank you to you as well, Brett, for travelling all this way, given your travel schedule already. That's all I'm going to do, is to introduce the three of them to have a conversation. And please, if you are online,
thank you, Mel. So I will warm it up for my two distinguished panelists on this roundtable. I'd like to first make an intervention by asking everyone, to reimagine the structure, okay, for the manufacturing, industry surrounding AI and electronics, and this also echoes what Professor Henry Young, the chapter in sentence, he started by saying, used to be, for the dominant imaginary is the fabulous, okay, way, it's designed in California but made in these fabs, okay, Taiwan or Singapore, and or should we have now with the geopolitical, right? So I will come back maybe in the next round to talk more about the geopolitical dimension of this manufacturing process. But first, what is the fundamental? Should it be, Henry wrote in the chapter that it's unrealistic to have fabs everywhere. Okay, even though people want to, but look at the costs. Okay, not just the financial cost. This morning we also talk about the environmental, and also before lunch, one of the last things we talk about is why so many of the fabs came to this part of the world is because of labor, cheap labor, or we sometimes call it the myth of nimble fingers. Okay, Asian people have more nimble fingers too. So when we talk about the how many nanometers, it doesn't really matter how nimble is your finger. It's too big, it's too fast for the nanometer fabs, right? So going back to the original metaphors for the digital economy, right? We have the old polarization between the bazaar and the cathedral. So I think those are the two original ideas, even though it was initially used for software, okay, this production process. But I think even when we talk about highly globally centralized, so that is a cathedral, right? Bazaar is the fabs everywhere model, right? We know we cannot go, I agree with Harry that we cannot go to the fabs everywhere model, but there are certain global powers, or including regional powers, try to get, maybe not for the semiconductor chips, but because the whole production chain, there are many production chains, right? For mobile phone, for laptop, for automobile, okay, different chipsets, right? And we'll just let's. So I think besides the highly centralized hierarchy of the cathedral model and the bazaar model, there's another model that's we sometimes called it's the cosmolocalism. So what is basically is to say what is light should be global. We can share the designs, open source, right? And one of the key thinkers in this is Michel Bowens, who started the peer-to-peer foundation and lives in Southeast Asia now, right? And in Thailand specifically. So the knowledge, the bits, okay, the immaterial aspects for the design of the hardware can be shared globally, right? Frictionless, okay, through GitHub or similar online structures of sharing ideas, sharing designs. Whereas at the local level, like what is heavy should be made, should be manufactured locally in conditions that are appropriate for the local, including water, including labor conditions, and also needs on what kind of raw material supply on the ground. Some of them may be 3D printable, not for the microchips, right? But for other components, right? Or packaging. Right? I think I used to work in work injury factories in southern China. The worst injury happened in packaging process, actually. Right? People losing entire limbs during for the packaging of electronics. So if the cosmolocalism can be there, and then the designers also knows cosmolocalism is not just for the local manufacturers to take the design from the global, but also they improve it. Right? So maybe Singapore can help other tropical regions to do localized manufacture, for packaging, right, in a tropical condition, but not so much for colder places. So I think those are at least three very different models to think about, right, how manufacturing can be organized. So I just want to open this by what are the fundamental, because when we talk about changing labor conditions within the manufacturing process, if we only started from the factory floor upwards, you can only reach certain levels. So sometimes, especially for a roundtable discussion, I think maybe we should try to start from the opposite. How can we imagine what would be a better way to reimagine, okay, or a combination of two or three of these imaginaries, or maybe there are fourth or fifth options.
Okay. So yeah, thanks, Jack, on that. So I think that's a great starting point for us. The cathedral has a very interesting history in terms of the labour relations that were required to build cathedrals. The Linchuan Cathedral famously was the tallest building in the world for 300 or 400 years. And it was an enormous structure because of the power of the institution, of the church that supported it, to extract extraordinary value from the ordinary working people around Lincoln. I think I guess I was thinking about Henry's last slide, where you were saying, what are the research agendas for us for the future? And one of the issues you noted as significant in terms of potential implications is future technological change. So let's just think ahead a little bit and from where we are now, and think about, well, what are the significant changes that we can see coming ahead, apart from the end of the world, that are likely to influence the shape of manufacturing and the tech industries in in our region and globally. And it struck me, I was thinking about this over the weekend. I think that the next generation of wireless networks are going to be very important for these. This is about what we call 6G, the successor set of standards to our current 5G and 4G networks, and also the future of Wi-Fi, the networking standards that we often use for indoor locations like where we are now. And I think that if we were to, I mean, and this is the crudest possible account of things, but you can imagine the world of 5G is a world of cathedrals, and it's a world of warring cathedrals, actually. It's the story of 5G is the story of international industrial and commercial and technological cooperation and coordination transforming into coordination being reconceptualized as risk, as geopolitical risk. So it's the story that we've been talking about today. And of course, it's striking that even before we saw the chip war, we had the 5G war. So Huawei was excluded from 5G infrastructure in Western countries before, in fact, the sales of chips to Huawei was banned. So that's the story of 5G. I think the story of 6G is, you know, I'll talk a little bit more about it as we go if we have time, but I think again it's a story of not just a cathedral, but of cathedrals and alliances of cathedrals and rivalrous churches. It's a very, very complex distributed industrial structure, which in some ways corresponds to the complex landscape that Henry was talking about in the context of chips and ICT in East Asia. In other ways, some differences which I'll come to, but I do think one of the very significant things about it is that when we look at the network hardware that's required to run the infrastructures for modern wireless communication systems, 5G and 6G, what's notable is that there was no US manufacturer of that hardware. We're talking the story is a story about Europe, and it's about East Asia, and that does change things significantly. Of course, where the Americans are important is in control of devices that use those services to some degree. But just a final comment, I suppose I think that if we're thinking about a bazaar or a cosmo-local model for power relations in wireless communications, that's when we start to think about Wi-Fi, something quite different and an alternative set of futures.
Okay, thank you. Fascinating discussion. As many of you know, I've been involved for the last 15 years or so in critical logistics studies. And that means I have a certain kind of take on these questions. So for instance, Henry, when I see your very complex GPN diagrams, I notice that there are arrows pointing from one institution to the other. And my questions are always, what's happening in those arrows? And when you delve into that question, you find it's just as variegated and complex as what's happening in the boxes. And when I come to notions around certain industries, we're talking about semiconductors today, having regional locations due to cheap labor, I tend to see that also as a trade-off against transport costs, because you know, when you're saying we'll have our factory in this part of the world and then we'll transport the goods, or we'll bring the inputs to this factory from other parts of the world, there's labor there as well, and there's cost there as well. So there's the question of mobility is built into the question about labor for me at a conceptual level and from the very start, and the way I begin to think about this. So this inflects the kind of question that Jack is asking around Bazaar Cathedral and cosmolocalism. And we can deal with this at an imaginary level. But when I start to imagine, I also have to think, well, how are we going to get there? We can agree that cosmolocalism sounds like a nice model that the world might try to build towards. And we can agree that we might end up with alliances between cathedrals that were warring as a more realistic prospect. But how do we begin to mediate between what it might look like due to what wireless does and what we might think is a viable model. So I guess these are the questions I come to when I think about these issues. I have to turn to the issue of supply chain governance and how much can be done within the value chain, within the production network in terms of its internal governance in order to make these kinds of adjustments where we would have a frictionless exchange of, I don't know, intellectual property and open source development and so forth, but keep the heavy lifting local. It does seem to me a question about how you govern these networks. However, I don't think, and this is, here I work more from the perspective of anthropological studies of value chains and supply chains. There are allied disciplines, both field disciplines, but what I read, for instance, in the anthropology is about the limits of governance inside the chain, relates to the idea of embeddedness, it relates to the circumstances, social and cultural, that exist in different parts of the world. So nobody, is building colonialism or patriarchy into the internal governance of their supply chains, but these things exist in different configurations around the world. So we have to be aware of this kind of inside-outside dynamic in the way these situations are working, and the limits of what can be done through things like standard making and writing in the environmental goals into contracts that will hopefully cascade throughout the network, and so forth. I don't see a prospect for a complete lack of friction at some kind of cosmopolitan level of exchange. And I think that the possibilities for building along these three different lines are going to be shaped by what we're glossing as geopolitical conflict. But how I think about that is something that maybe I should return to in the next round.
So with this, let's start to talk about geopolitics. Right? I think in the morning we already get the sense of the manufacturing process used to be dominated by cathedrals of the corporate, capitalist type. Right? But now, there are some even older cathedrals, right? You can think about this corporate Silicon Valley or Huawei, Alibaba are the Protestants, okay, the Anglican Church, all right, but then there's still the older one, is the Catholic, cathedrals. Those are the state, nation states, right? And it's especially the bigger ones, there is US and China, right? So I think much of the discussion today, okay, is actually about how the old guards are coming back, right? National security. So that actually would what Brett has talked about, the friction, the worry is that there will be, when we talk about Apple competing with Huawei, okay, or Huawei competing with Cisco, of course there are corporate secrets. Okay, there are nasty moves of legal battles, okay, suing each other, right? That's a constant. And I know even as we speak, some Chinese corporations are still, waiting for their court ruling when they sue each other. In ways sometimes even worse than between Microsoft and Apple. And but then when we talk about the US, okay, the security states and the Chinese security state coming back, the level of secrecy, they're not the possibility is not just legal battles that can be settled in the amounts, okay, or maybe a few people go to jail, right? But when we talk about wars this morning, okay, or including in Asia, we're worried about those are wars that will cost much more, right, in terms of human lives and disaster. Wars are also environmentally disastrous, not just for society. So there's a reason, okay, why US-China delinking, okay, dominates the headline, because they control, okay, the military forces. Military being also part of the most important customers and funding sources, okay, for this R&D. And I feel free to disagree. All right, we are maybe you have different reading, but when I think back, at from Trump to Biden's time, and especially given what we are seeing now, right? So I like to compare the US-China electronic, okay, manufacturing related war to the outer space, the space race. Right? So Julian just mentioned Huawei could not join the 5G game because the door was shut. Right? And actually, I've been looking at Huawei and Cisco for nearly 20 years ago. Right? There's even before between the corporate warfare, the US interfered. The Chinese government also interfered, probably in ways I do not know because it's not as transparent. Right? But nearly 20 years ago, when Huawei standard people tried to go to the US for a standards discussion conference, they were denied visa. Right, so that's the state intervening, and this actually are the story that English media do not tell lots of the readers, right? And but if you look at the outer space, okay, race, actually it's precisely because China was shut out of the international, space station. Now they're building their own Tiangong, right? The space, outspace, almost by itself, because initially it was supposed to be having assistance from the Russians, but now Russians are not they're too busy with other things, right? So that actually is hurting. Okay, I think this strategy of shutting out another potential competitor, right? I think China did this to themselves for search engine, for other things. When you shut out a competitor, you may see short-term gains, but in the longer term, because we talk about geopolitical, right? It's about longer term. It's not that maybe this kind of shutting out Huawei or shutting out Google can benefit, okay, in the tactical way, benefit your industrial military complex in the short term. But in the longer term, there seems to be, opposite effects. That given, even though the Kirin 9000 chip is not the most cutting edge, okay, but this is only the beginning to show that the policy can have not only it may not have the intended consequences, it can even have unintended opposite effects. I don't know whether you agree with my analysis or not.
I don't know whether I agree with it or not, Jack, but I think that what I find interesting is that alongside these recent histories, there continue to be very significant commercial and governmental and intergovernmental investments in coordination, because there is a lot at stake for the ICT industries, not just in North America, not just in China, but in Asia and in Europe, in coordination. If there is a failure to agree on a new set of global standards for wireless communication, that has consequences for every player. So everybody loses if 5G is the last G. Like, you know, remember that in some way it seems quaint that we still call our smartphones phones, but they are phones. They still are phones. We can travel around the world and make a call with them. And the reason we can do that is because of an extraordinary coalition of institutional structures across technology and governmental and intergovernmental organisations that have been evolved over at least 30 years, and of course going back well before that. So this is not just one organisation, it's a number of them. And most of the critical players in in the landscape of these kinds of very complex standards are themselves associations of associations. So they are designed to bring the Chinese telecoms industry into the same room as the Americans. It's interesting actually that in some of these critical organisations, in fact, there are more Asian members of these bodies than there are North Americans or Europeans in the room, but they all have an interest in an outcome. So it is quite possible that geopolitics turns out to trump everything else. But if coordination can be reconceptualized as risk, it's also possible that it can be reconceptualized the other way as well. And so one of the things that's very interesting about 6G is that in addition to the usual sort of stories about what this technology must do and what its kind of technical capabilities could be, it is also intended to take on some of this extra freight that has been accumulated around the digital economy in the last decade. So the security concerns, that how do you secure users' privacy? Can you build that into the network infrastructure in some way? And of course, the big one is what they call sustainability. And that drives the most striking feature of 6G compared to our previous generations of communication, which is that the idea that this is a network architecture which is entirely automated and which builds AI into the way it works. So it's entirely integrated now. And I guess what I find interesting about it, at least in part, is that sustainability imperative is very visible in the industry and governmental language around wireless communication, not just for 6G also, but actually also for current and future versions of Wi-Fi. And that, as I say, this is what is actually this is seen as one of the critical reasons why these networks need to be more automated and more intelligent in the sense of having machine learning or flavors of machine learning, like federated learning, built into it. I'm sure that answers response.
Yes.
I'm sort of suggesting there can be a coordination between the proposals at the very least.
Well, it is interesting that it's around scientific cooperation on climate change that we find the US and China converging. And in short, China pulled out of this cooperation after Pelosi's visit to Taiwan in August, but then they came back, and it seems that this level of cooperation on this issue is, the first one where the parties are prepared to come back together, even as they're, cutting each other out of other things. So Jack, yes, I agree with you about the long-term consequences, geopolitical consequences of cutting a party out of, a certain technology. If 5G is the last G, and we can't, we'll have to have two phones, one working, or three, one working to the Russian, one working to the US, and one working to the Chinese standard to make a call back home. Then I guess that's a situation we have to deal with. But one thing we discovered in our logistics research is that you find these points of mismatch and so-called choke points, or places where the standards aren't matching up, even when you have the technological connection in place for other reasons. So to give you one instance, when we were working in the port of Piraeus in Athens, which is like a crown jewel of the Belt and Road port system, that at the time we were working there, the port was divided into two different parts. They were both running different terminal operating systems. In order for these systems to communicate with each other, it's easy. It's called electronic data interchange. There are protocols that have existed for a long time, but nonetheless, when containers were passing from one side to the port to the other, they were there. There was someone there doing the paperwork. 124 strike, 124 strike, and following it in this kind of analog way. So you can have these kind of mismatches even when the standards are matching.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So I think it's a mistake to say if we have the standards in place, then the conflicts won't happen. Which is not what I'm saying.
Well, 5G is an example of that. The conflicts do happen. So we can have a phone here in Singapore that's made in China, that's designed in California, say, and which uses network hardware designed in Europe. Yeah, it works, but there's a long story about the conflicts between them, but the divisions between the Chinese telecoms industry and the Europeans actually shaped the whole design of 5G. So it was really built around a set of compromises between different proprietary interests and different technologies that have been developed in those different places. So some flexibility, but you're absolutely right. It is no recipe for peace.
I mean, we have to ask what is geopolitics, what we mean when we talk about that. And, often this is seen as something like interstate rivalry. We go back to the, geographical origins of geopolitics in Europe and so forth. But clearly we also have to think about it with respect to geoeconomics and the relation between geoeconomics and geopolitics. If you look at the wars in the world today, I think you see the geoeconomics more clearly in the Ukraine situation and the China-US situation than you do in the Middle East situation, which seems, more kind of geopolitical in a sense that you have these kind of, almost like a competition for the future of nationalism, where you see different kinds of forces aligning around this conflict in ways that, their own vision of their own nationalism might be reflected through an Israeli nationalism or a Palestinian nationalism, which are very different kinds of nationalism, right? But we could say the same thing around versions of globalization. And when you look at the fault lines, the geopolitical fault lines, I see them much more as struggles for the future of globalization and for exerting influence and control over global processes than I do as a kind of retreat to the nation state and classical interstate rivalry. So if you think about the Belt and Road Initiative, if you think about Russia's control of energy flows, if you think about US influence around the world exercised through dollar domination of the financial system, these are all kind of key fronts in what we think about as geopolitics today, but they're also highly geoeconomical. And this is a challenge, no? How do we keep this in view when the mainstream analysis is about interstate rivalry? That's the narrative we have. How do we move from an analytical perspective that's very accessible, that tells this story and can work as a self-fulfilling prophecy for war, towards one that has this more kind of complex geoeconomic kind of front to it? I think these are important questions as we face these challenges and think about these imaginaries.
Yeah, definitely. I think the difference between geopolitics and geoeconomics, there are many differences. One of them is the assumption, okay, for geoeconomics is that, okay, if there are scarce resources, so it's an economic rational, okay, choice background, right? So at the end of the day, we can compromise, we can reach a deal, okay, so that it's possible to have, if not to say win-win situation, at least some kind of balance, right, of distribution of cost and profits. Whereas when it comes to geopolitics, especially in the context of war, and this war can be ending in a lose-lose situation. Nobody wins, right? So if we look at the past, actually, some years ago, what Brett talked about as we need a Chinese phone, a Russian phone, an American phone, almost happened to our laptops in 2005. China wanted to have a Wi-Fi encryption system that all the laptops sold in China will have to use, but not the. But then the reason that this was in 2005. That China finally used it as a chip, okay, to trade with the US, or that US will buy other kinds of goods. The reason that the politicians were willing to, the geopolitical logic succumb to the geoeconomic reasoning is because they were internal, right? Huawei was actually leading, okay? There are other techno-nationalists who say we should have this system to make sure Wi-Fi system, laptop-based Wi-Fi system in China are absolutely secure, okay? And Microsoft will not have a backdoor into Chinese laptops, right? And but then it's really because of the internal, right? So what I'm thinking of observing is that, for example, even though US is telling Huawei not to buy, right? Telling Singapore, other people, other countries not to buy Huawei. Actually, the trade data of US imports from China as computer and telecom as a whole declined a little bit. But if you look at the telecom equipment, much of this would, I think, would be Huawei. I don't know how much it would be 5G, definitely not, maybe 4G or other type of but then there were actually 4.8% of increase, from 2021 to 2022. So who are the people who are buying? So I think here we can bring in a class analysis. These are the poor telecos, teleco co-ops in rural America, who needs to provide affordable connectivity to American farmers, right? They cannot afford for Cisco, whereas the Huawei servers or other equipment are designed, base stations are designed to work in the rural environments. So I think these are actually moments where internally, I think at the transnational level, not only scientists, actually in the special issue of ICS, I helped edit geopolitics of Chinese internet. It started with analysis about Chinese scientists and technicians participating in standard making IETF. There is a systematic analysis of all the open discussion documents. Shows that the Chinese representatives are, the more they join, the more they speak the same language, not a unique Beijing agenda. So that's at least with all the public documents from IETF, this has been shown. But so what I think is for politicians, tech scientists, bureaucrats, when there's a geo-economic logic for the transnational capitalist class, I would even for the sake of over-implication. But at the same time, we need to think about the internal class, the people who are working class users or rural users or makers when there's an uproar, from the assembly line, and that could cause another kind of lose-lose empire collapse situation. Yeah.
Great points. We can all, I think
We've
been told
only a
something.
couple of minutes left before we have Jenny. So do you have any final contributions?
No,
or urgent
I mean,
response?
any questions?
Need to cut me short.
There's always one to say about it. We can talk a long time.
Just say something quickly in response to Jack's comments about internal dynamics in China. And the sort of fascinating thing about the standard is that you can have a cultural ascription as well. And what I mean by that is that, for example, I really noticed when I was living there in the mid-2000s, the problem of the way telecommunications was regulated across provinces meant that in order, as people moved for work from one city to another, in one region to another, you would have to carry multiple SIM cards. And the economy of the telecommunications market and the regulation of movement at the level of labor mobilities was structured in concert. So that was sort of fascinating. At the same time, the unexpected side effect of this was that it became a kind of informal research and development with scalar potential for the rest of the world and the design of mobile handset market, mobile handsets, mobile phones. So, from these sort of peculiar idiosyncratic national conditions, we had a scaling of the technological device as a commodity form that became standardized internationally.
So we have mobile phone with multiple SIM cards.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It took a while for that to take off elsewhere. It was born out of the informal, Shanghai kind of, culture, tech design, and then becomes sort of expropriated as R&D for nothing by the big tech firms who are interested in phones with mobile SIMs. So I found that sort of unexpected, a great instance of an unexpected consequence.
The history of the industry is full of those things. It's the great stories. I guess what I would just say, I mean, responding to Brett's comments and Jack's, I think, is just how significant the institutions that we have are. Like, when we say we don't know how we're going to do this, governments, businesses in this space, civil society to a lesser but significant degree have been creating the structures where we can have these arguments for decades. And this is geopolitics. Politics requires institutions, it requires media, it requires a forum, and these things do exist. The question is whether they themselves are sustainable. When we have the sorts of pressures we've seen over the last decade. But what I think is interesting is actually the very persistent and resilient degree of commitment to it. Maybe it is the fact, as you were saying, Jack, once people are in a room, it's interesting how they start speaking in a similar language. But just one last point, your argument around affordability, that is such a critical question, which I think is entirely submerged in the 6G space. What's interesting is that it's very visible and prominent in the Wi-Fi space.